Hi everybody, Dr. Lund here. We're going to talk about differentiation in this video. Some of you who've had me before for a methods course or for ED 3780 or 5780 will have heard me talk about differentiation. I did make some revisions specific to content area reading, so I encourage you to review this video regardless. So today we're going to talk about three areas in which teachers can differentiate and three different approaches to differentiation. And our focus here is on content area literacy. So first, the three areas. The three areas are content, process, and product. Content is what students learn. Process is how they learn that content, how they engage with it. And product is how they demonstrate their understanding. And you're going to see there is overlap here. Process and product often do overlap because the process through which we learn content is sometimes also how we demonstrate our understanding of that content. The three approaches, whoops, turned off closed captions. The three approaches to differentiation are differentiating readiness, or I should say differentiating by students' readiness, by students' interest, and by students' learning profile. So we have three areas in which to differentiate: content, process, product, and then three approaches. And approaches probably isn't the right word. It's the best word I can think of because I want to say areas for both, but it's a different area. So the three approaches: readiness, interest, learning profile. So we're going to talk in this video about content, process, and product. And then within each of those, as appropriate, we'll talk about how that looks for readiness, for interest, and for learning profile. So for content, content is what we teach or what we want our students to learn. And to differentiate that, we need to adapt what we teach or adapt how we give students access to material. What does that mean? So by adapting what we teach, for example, we can use different materials. A classic example is materials written at different reading levels. So we might have on grade level materials. We might have materials for readers that struggle more with reading and materials for students that can handle more challenge with reading. In sort of a traditional textbook driven environment, oftentimes the grade level quote unquote textbook really isn't written at grade level, it's written several years above. There were publishers, and I'm sure they're still around, who specialize in high interest, low reading level texts. So it still looks like a textbook, but the language is simpler, which is sometimes adopted for students in special education, for students who are learning English, but is also appropriate sometimes for other students who might not have any label, but who still need an easier text to read. For somebody who needs a more challenging text, some teachers will use a college textbook or, portions of a college textbook. But as I mentioned in my AI video, there appears to be some AI tools that can actually take an article, for example, and revise it to be at earlier or easier or harder reading levels. And as I mentioned there, I'm not vouching for the accuracy of those tools. I don't have a ton of trust for AI tools, but if they work, and you would always need to double check that work because oftentimes mistakes might happen, it could be really, really helpful for something like this. Another thing to do, though, is to make sure you are establishing a collection of materials at different levels. And I know that right now, those of you who aren't yet teaching don't know what you're going to teach, right? You may be licensed to teach biology, but you don't know if you're going to end up teaching middle school science or if you're going to teach, regular biology or honors biology or AP biology or something else. But even then, I would encourage you to start thinking about what you would like to teach and start gathering things that are related to that and look for things that are at different levels. Some things that are written for high school students, for middle school students, for elementary students, for college students, for the general public, all of which are going to be at different reading levels, have different approaches, and just start collecting them. If they're digital, make sure you save them as a PDF or other format that's going to still be around, hopefully, when you're teaching, and put them on, put them in a folder you have for them in the cloud or on a USB drive or something else. We can also, though, sometimes students are going to read the same thing. We can adapt student access by having everyone read the same thing, but have different procedures for different students or different groups of students. So, for example, faster readers can read at their own pace, but they're going to be given independent activities to do as they read or at the end of the reading. Slower readers are going to read with more peer support or more teacher support. They might still have activities, but they're going to be different sorts of activities that are less time consuming because more of their time is spent on the reading act. Readiness differentiation is here is what I've really been talking about so far. It's important that we teach to individual students, not to just sort of this mythical average student or student in the middle. We need to help each of our students get to where they need to be. And as part of that, we need to consider their reading level and their background knowledge. Interest differentiation is including materials that build on individual students' interests. When I taught social studies in high school, I was teaching US history one year, and I had a student who loved military history and was fascinated with Napoleon. And Napoleon doesn't really relate to US history, but at the same time, I used his interest in military history to let him sort of go off on his own sometimes while we were doing stuff in US history. I could have him do sort of the core thing to show, yes, you still know this US history standard. You've demonstrated that you know it. But now you can go and use your class time to read about Napoleon or to read about military history somewhere else. So, like when we were studying the Civil War in the US, what was going on in Europe in the 1860s or in Asia in the 1860s, and what was their military technology like? Again, I could still say the student was meeting standards because he had proven to me through pre assessments or other things that he knew the standards he was supposed to know for US history. And that meant that I was free to differentiate for him. And then learning profile is what methods work. Some of the research has worked best. I prefer to say really what methods an individual prefers, like learning preferences. And we'll talk more about that in a follow up video where I talk about some myths of education. But these are things, might be things like, does a student like to work on their own or with somebody else? Do they want to be creative or not? Things like that. So here are some strategies. I'm going to put in the links some books in the library that are ebooks so everyone can access them that relate to differentiation that are very useful. They're a little dated and there's a few myths in there that I'll talk about in another video, but they still remain really important in the field and I highly recommend them. And that's where I got a lot of this information from. So, one good differentiation strategy that is often used for kids who are gifted, but it's also used for kids with significant disabilities, is curriculum compacting. And in that case, you focus on what standards you think are most important for the student to know in your content area. Which ones are tested the most, which ones are most needed for the next year, things like that. And if it's a student with a really significant intellectual disability, you're going to focus on those standards because that way that student is going to have more focused instruction on the core things rather than limited instruction on everything that probably isn't going to help them a lot. For gifted students, you're going to give them an opportunity to show all of the standards, sort of like I did to that student I was talking about earlier. And then with the time they have left, because they've demonstrated their understanding, they can work on other things related to your content area. And that demonstrative understanding can be simple as having that student take the unit exam at the start of the unit. And if they get, a 90% or above, or maybe an 80% or above, you might require them to remediate in whatever standards they missed on that exam. But then they can have that time, again, to do things that interest them that are related to your content. That relates also to learning contracts. As I mentioned, using varied materials is important. Another good strategy to use are providing mini lessons. This is helpful if we know that we have a student or a group of students, or maybe even our whole class who is missing prerequisite skills. We can provide a mini lesson on those skills. Using reading buddies, if that is something that your school has, can be really beneficial. That's one thing that's really nice about in smaller districts that have K-12 buildings, especially. Um, that can be really helpful to have students in high school and middle school partner with an elementary teacher, because some students who struggle in middle and high school with, say, reading at grade level are entirely capable of reading with a second grader. That gives them important practice reading, important practice with fluency. It builds connections, of course, across the school community. It can be very beneficial in a variety of ways. Using graphic organizers, I know you've talked about in other courses. Um, Doing different types of things with unit summaries, having those available, having print materials that have key ideas highlighted, and the use of mentors, either peers or adults. If that's something that works in your setting, can be highly beneficial here. So those are all ideas of differentiating content. Process. Process, in other words, is the activities that students do when they engage in our content. And sort of the classic definition of a good activity is something that students will either make or do that uses an essential skill and essential information for your content. And they do it in order to understand an essential idea or to answer an essential question of your content. A good differentiated activity is the same thing, except two things are added. One is that students will do these activities in a range of modes at different degrees of sophistication, potentially in varying time spans. And they will have varied amounts of support from others. So when we look at process differentiation by readiness, what we want to do is look back at Lev Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development, that idea of sometimes called the Goldilocks zone of instructional tasks that are just right. They aren't too easy, they aren't too hard. And so we want to match how complex a task is with the student's current level of understanding and skill. By interest, as I mentioned before with content, again, there's a lot of overlap here. Give students choices about what areas or facets of a topic they want to specialize in, or help them link a personal interest to a goal or a standard in your curriculum. And again, for process, by learning profile, using a student's preferred way of learning, alone or with a partner, by seating arrangement, again, being creative or not. And so some ideas here that some different process possibilities include using different writing approaches, like using learning logs or student journals, having students again use graphic organizers, different models for giving students choice, and these are called different things. Um, a common one that I used a lot in the classroom is a tic-tac-toe approach, which is simply a piece of paper that is in 9 squares, like a tic-tac-toe board. And in a tic-tac-toe approach here, you don't have to make a tic-tac-toe. You don't have to do 3 across or 3 vertically or 3 diagonally. You just have to do 3 of them. And each box is a different um, activity to do as the student is learning. This also can relate to product as well. Again, there's overlap. And it's okay to set limits. So, for example, when I was teaching English classes, I wanted my students to have opportunities to do things beyond just writing, but my students also needed to write. So I would often tell them, here are your 9 choices. Please notice that the top row are all writing options. You must choose at least one writing option. But for the others, the other 2 can be anything you want from the other areas. Similarly, I sometimes had students who didn't really want to be creative, but creative expression was something I had to teach and wanted to teach. And so I would make them do something that was creative, and then their other choices didn't have to be. So that's a tic-tac-toe board. A cubing idea or a choice board is very, very similar to that. Those of you who are elementary getting your middle school endorsements have probably heard of learning centers at different times. And learning centers don't have to just be a preschool and early elementary thing. We mentioned learning contracts with content. They're also appropriate here. And there's all sorts of different models for discussion. That includes a jigsaw approach. And there's various versions of it. This is where students are given a reading selection, but students are grouped, and each member of the group is given a different part of the selection, and then they come together to talk about the entire thing. So, one person is given the first part and one the second part and one the third part and so on. Um, TPS is, by that I mean think, pair, share, which you've all done, having debates, having role playing activities. Again, some of these work better for certain content areas than others, but all of them are potentially ways that process, and in some cases as well, product, can be differentiated. And because we're at the 15-minute mark, I'm going to stop here rather than try to power through. So we will conclude with part two. I want to thank you for watching part one. If you have any questions, please reach out. Have a good rest of your week.